What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Nurture Network podcast. Now, today's guest is actually a really funny story how I met him. I've actually been following this guest for the last 6 months since he launched his own podcast, actually. And funny story, I literally just bumped into him last week, I believe, in the coffee shop just below my office. So small world. I wasn't too sure if it was actually him. But I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to say hello now, just in case. You have to take these opportunities because honestly, I really like the content he produces. It's had a massive impact on me, even starting my own podcast. So I just went over to him, took a big leap of faith, and introduced myself, and we had a little conversation going. And the power of asking questions. I asked him to come on the podcast, and thankfully he said yes. So I'm really glad that Amardeep is here, the co-founder of the Bay HQ, which I'll let him, introduce a bit further. But he's also, just to spit some facts about some really cool facts actually about him. He was the second fastest growing writer on medium.com after Barack Obama, which is pretty amazing. He's interviewed founders of Netflix and Twitter, and he's also previously worked in tech consulting for 7 years. So a really cool repertoire of facts there. Now, Amardeep, why don't you just quickly just introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. So you covered like the bits I like to boast about there. So thank you for that. Saves me from doing myself. Um, so what I do now is I run the Bay HQ. So it's inspiring, connecting, and guiding the next generation of British Asians. And behind that bold statement, what we're actually doing, you've got the podcast, you've got news coverage, you've got events, all of that kind of stuff. And it's come from stuff I've done in America where I've done a lot of stuff for people in Silicon Valley. So I'm trying to use that experience out there to now help people here in our community. And that's the fundamentals of what I do, but can go into more details as we go along.
Amazing. I love it. I love it. Honestly. And I will let you boast a little bit about those facts, right? I mean, let's just quickly pick that fact on second fastest growing writer on medium.com after Barack Obama. Just tell me a bit about that. I mean, what did you write about? How did you find this out? Please, I think the audience would love to know.
Sure. So it's a complete fluke. January 2020, New Year's resolution. I'll start writing online. No one's going to care. You know, the whole new year, new me kind of thing, right? I had no real experience of writing. And it was more about, I was reading a lot at the time, a lot of self development, a lot of personal development, and thinking, oh, like, I'm reading all these ideas, but I've got my own ideas too. Can I put them out there? And there was no plan, there was no strategy. But my first article I wrote went viral straight away. And I was getting a lot of good feedback. I made a bit of money on that as well. And that positive feedback then encouraged me to keep going. And then obviously the pandemic happened and I couldn't go outside, didn't have a social life. So I started writing more and more. And it was crazy, right? Because I went from never writing to then all of a sudden having millions of views, all of these followers. And for that Barack Obama stat, I like that stat because it's just cool, right? And I'm gonna use that stat with my grandkids, even if I'm not writing for the last 50 years or something like that, just because I that's the only time I can put myself and Barack Obama in the same sentence. But yeah, it was just a rocket ship. And it's like you said, the power of questions, the power of just putting yourself out there, right? There was no expectations from that, but off the back of that writing is everything that I'm doing today. If I hadn't had the guts to put myself out there and to put my writing out there and for people to read that and to people to find me, I would never be doing what I'm doing today. And the thing is, if I had failed, it wouldn't have mattered, right? If nobody read my articles, then I enjoyed the process. And that's the important thing too, is that it worked out for me in terms of the writing and where I've got to. But let's say I just wrote a few articles and then stopped. I still achieved something by just trying and putting myself out there and learning something new and having that new skill on board as well. And I think that's what sometimes people forget.
Mm, absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is what this podcast is about, right? It's about helping people to unlock those tools to take the leap on things that they've always wanted to try but have been afraid of. And I say it every episode because it's important for me to reiterate that message to the viewers to really keep, the message consistent and for people to actually recognize the value of actually doing that thing and taking the leap. Like you mentioned, if you hadn't started, you wouldn't have been able to achieve what you did and be doing what you're doing now. And your life has probably taken, some twists and turns, perhaps things that you haven't, anticipated happening. And I just love stories like that because it just shows by putting yourself out there, you know, the art of the possible. It could have been very different if you hadn't. But out of curiosity, Amardeep, what were you writing about? What kind of articles were you writing about?
The very first one, so here's another random cool fact, is I did karate for over a decade. So I was in the national squad at one point. I went out to Japan, trained out there. So I think karate has had a huge impact on the way I think, my discipline, the way I kind of attack problems as well. And what I was doing is taking the Japanese philosophy and then trying to apply it to everyday life in the Western world and how those different mindsets could help me. So that very first article was four Japanese mindsets to transform your state of mind, which were, oh, test me now, Soshin, Fudoshin, Zanshin, and the other one. It will come back to me later. But it's basically different mindsets which help me in my day-to-day life of thinking, okay, here's what state I'm in. And Soshin is probably the most famous because it's a beginner's mind. So it's used in a lot of different books. And the idea of it doesn't matter how good you are at anything, you can always learn. It doesn't matter if somebody's better than you, somebody's been training 50 years, you've been training for a year. You can learn from beginners, you can learn from people at the top, you can learn from your peers. And that's a mindset which the masters would use in karate and across like Japanese culture from Zen Buddhism. And then it was also a lot of random stuff, right? That was the original articles. But I didn't have a plan. And I think it's quite important for me to be open about that because I think a lot of people don't start because they over plan. They've got to get things perfect. And now what I'm doing today with the Bay HQ, I plan the crap out of that because I've got a lot of experience. I know what I'm doing now. And at the beginning, just throw stuff out there, just try. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And the other stuff I wrote about, I'm trying to remember those days now. God, I'm getting old 3 years ago. A lot of it was just experimentation, right? Is this interesting? This is an idea that's interesting to me. Let's test it out. A book I read that I didn't agree with. A lot of the article ideas actually came from that, where I was reading advice from other people or listening to advice and thinking, I really don't like how they're framing things. And then I do the counter argument, but do it without attacking anybody else, just saying, here's what I think you should do instead. Then what then happened is I became the editor of Entrepreneur's publication on Medium called the Entrepreneur's Handbook. And that's a big part of where this rocket ship came from, right? Which again is just serendipitous. What I was doing at the time, I was helping people in Facebook groups on how to write. So there's lots of these Facebook groups about writing. So you join them, get feedback on your work. And for some reason, even though I was a beginner myself, I was giving a lot of people feedback and helping them out. And that got noticed by some of the more experienced writers to say, oh, who's this new guy who's trying to help out other people, right? I wasn't doing it for anything. There's no financial reward. There's no real benefit for me. It was just fun. I was a way of learning, right? It's to assess other people's work and, oh, do I do that? Oh, is that boring? If they do it and that's disinteresting to me, maybe I do the same thing and I can learn. But off the back of that, I then was asked to become the editor of that publication. And it's because of being the editor of that publication where at the time in the peak of that, in the pandemic, you'd get a few hundred articles a week submitted from entrepreneurs all across the world. And that's how my network started massively expanding very quickly because I had that gatekeeper effect, right? Where I was rejecting 95% of articles and giving these people who might have been had multi-million-dollar companies advice on how to write better. And that was the flip, right? Because from there, I then had a skill which I'd only learned in a very short amount of time, but I could apply to a lot of people and help a lot of people through that. And that's where the later things came on in terms of some of the people you mentioned in terms of interviewing. It comes from that. But again, that's pure fluke. I didn't have this master plan. I want to become the editor of that. I want to do this. I didn't even think about becoming an editor. Then I was offered the position. I was like, oh, that sounds like fun. Let's try it out. And here I am 3 years later, right?
Fantastic. I mean, I was actually going to touch on that because I was going to ask, the work that you did in terms of the articles, was that a direct correlation with, going into the interviews with founders of, people at Netflix and Twitter, etc.? I'm assuming yes, like you just mentioned. Going through that journey, and like you said, you didn't really have, a set plan, and I feel like it's like that with a lot of people who go and just go for it and do it. When you make a plan that's too rigid, it's almost you're not going to be able to go with that flow and go as far as you believe, because I was the same. Even like starting a podcast, um, I almost talked myself out of it just by trying to plan too much, like thinking that I had to have every single episode set out, every piece of equipment, like expensive equipment, ready. And I kind of procrastinated about the idea, and it's probably the reason why it took me this long to begin. Um, but when you were going through that process of, expanding your network, etc., and you were getting to, speak with these caliber of people, and interviewing these type of people, was there an element of, did you ever feel, almost intimidated, or have that feeling of, imposter syndrome, where, you're surrounded by people who are founders of companies, etc., etc., and you're there like, how do I converse with these type of people? What was that like for you, when you were expanding your network?
So the first podcast started once I'd left my job. So it was the idea of like writing is now my full time job. So I need a new hobby, in a way, a new side hustle. And that was the podcast originally. And the first few episodes I did of the podcast, it was intentional. I gave myself a deadline of I'm going to launch a podcast by this date. It's similar to how I did the New Year's resolution, start writing, and I'm just going to do it. And if nobody cares, nobody cares. Cool, I've learned, so I'm going to try something new. And those first few episodes, I did it with all people that I knew pretty well already. And that was the benefit of me being in these writers' groups, me meeting lots of people through the work I was doing. It wasn't anybody I had to cold outreach to. It was already people who I had in my network. So that made things a lot easier, and that overcame some of that initial fear. But the first podcast was called Mindful and Driven. And the whole idea being about how people are very ambitious. How do they keep balance? How do they stop themselves from getting lost in that world? And you watch his first few episodes, it's still on YouTube somewhere. I was terrified. You can just see I'm awkward. I just like I'm not. I'm naturally an introvert, despite all the stuff I've now done. People get that mixed up, and I'd much rather talk one on one like this than in front of a huge crowd. And even speaking to the camera like this, when I started off, I was so nervous about that. I used to get heart palpitations. My arm would go like all numb. So people sometimes think, oh, you've got to be a certain kind of person to do the kind of things that we're doing right now. And you don't. I'm 180, 190, something like that episodes in. That's why, and even then, I'm not perfect, right? Still a lot to learn, but I'm much more comfortable and confident in what I'm doing than I was. I'd say the guest that scared me the most actually was Mark Randolph. So he's the founder of Netflix. So everything up until then, the first few episodes are scary, right? Because it's just first few, but then you get into a bit of a groove, you get moving along. Mark Randolph was maybe 50 episodes in, right? So I think sometimes we think, oh, the fear just goes away, but it doesn't, right? Because it was the biggest imposter syndrome moment of who the hell am I to be talking to Mark Randolph, the founder of Netflix? Because I'd be very surprised if anybody listening today doesn't know what Netflix is. And to have that household name company, the guy who made it, to be sitting there chatting to me, just felt really weird. And they reached out to me because they had a book coming out, and obviously I had the Entrepreneur's Handbook, so I had a fairly big online presence. And it was that weird moment of, are you sure you're meant to be reaching out to me? Is this what you were intending to do? It's like, I'm not going to say that, obviously, but I was thinking in my head, like, cool, I'm taking this, definitely. But then it was maybe 2 or 3 months until the actual interview happened. And then he couldn't join the room. He was having technical problems. So I was sitting there, terrified, thinking, have I just blown my big opportunity because of technical difficulties? And sitting there, sweating away. I had massive sweat patches. Before he even joined the call, before I even started talking to him, I was sweating away. My heart rate was going crazy. And I was like, oh, imagine if I faint on this call. That's this kind of stuff that's going through your brain in the run up to it. Then he joined, all cool, episode went well, and it's on YouTube, and you can see maybe 40 minutes into the episode or half an hour, whenever it is. The last 10, 15 minutes, we really connected a lot more because he started talking about his regrets and the things which, despite his success, how he still has these different problems. And for me, it was a big cornerstone moment, right? Of here's this dude who's created something which pretty much every entrepreneur, anybody who does their own thing, could inspire. Like one day could have bills as big as Netflix. He did that,
Mm,
and he still has regrets. He still has things which he wishes he'd done better. So he said that he wished he'd spent a lot more time with his kids when they're growing up, because he said, "What do all of these billions matter to me now, right? Well, what am I going to do with it?" But I didn't see those important moments with my kids. And what's really tough, and I think a lot of people suffer from this, is they hear stuff like that and say, but I still need to do it for myself. It's like, you don't need to make the mistakes yourself. You've got to pay attention to other people, and if they're telling you this was a huge mistake that I made by working so hard and missing that out.
mm,
But in terms of imposter syndrome, there, you feel it, but at the same time, now what I've realized is the top people I've interviewed. So Mark Randolph, Ev Williams is the founder. So he's the guy who invented the word blog. Then he founded Twitter. Then he founded
wow.
Medium. So he basically has, think about the way the internet works and the way blogging works, the way any written content on the internet works is because of that dude. And after the interview, he had time for half an hour to just chat about me. He's like, "Oh, what's going on in your life? Tell me your story." Same thing with Mark Randolph. After the interview, he chatted with me. "Tell me your story." All of the top people, Octopus Energy. So people in the UK will have heard of Octopus Energy. They see the ads everywhere. It's a purple
Yeah.
octopus, right? That company went from 0 to 6 billion in a few years. Greg
Mm,
Jackson, the founder of that, he sat there for another hour after the podcast had finished recording and chatted to me. And these people have really high responsibilities, but they're still
yeah.
curious and they're still human. And what you'll notice as you do more and more episodes as well is that the
Mm,
people who've really done a lot in their lives and really made a big impact, they're still curious. And they still eat, they still sleep, they still go to a
mhm,
toilet. None of them are that
mhm,
special. They're not aliens, right? They're all human.
mm,
They have the same thing. People can hurt their feelings. They can make mistakes. They can wish they said things in a different way. It's just
mhm,
circumstances. They've got a good skill, whatever it is, that have enabled them to have that extreme level of success. But
mhm,
they're not perfect. And I think sometimes there's that danger where people look up to people. And say Steve Jobs, for example. Steve Jobs, there was a period he just ate carrots.
mm,
Now, just because he was a visionary in terms of tech doesn't mean you should follow his life choices. He was a
mhm,
terrible dad as well. It's a common theme amongst people with entrepreneurs sometimes, is a lot of them are terrible parents. And
mhm,
they will regret this later on. But I think that's a huge lesson to take away for anybody listening is don't allow people to intimidate you. It's it's absolutely fine to treat people with respect. If somebody's trying to make you feel small, life's too
mm.
short. That's you don't have to create a problem, you don't have to create drama, but don't look up to them, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. I think one thing you mentioned there on that really kind of hit home with me, and something that I reiterate to people, to friends, to family, is the art of being curious, right? Having curiosity is something that I feel can get you very, very far. By being curious, you ask questions. By asking questions, you learn more. By learning more, you're just expanding your knowledge. And that's why those people have got to where they are, right? It's by being curious all the time. And it's nice to hear from yourself that, even after the camera shut off, after you've done with the interview, that they're asking about you. It at least, I think people perhaps, I don't know what they expect from, these people who are perhaps celebrities or famous, but not everyone is like that. Um, but meeting those kind of people who still have the humility, the time to be able to like chat with people and learn about your journey must have been, hugely beneficial for you as well, right?
Yeah, and I think a big part of it is it's even for example where I am now, right? I can't reply to everybody all
Mm,
the time, and sometimes if you DM me, I might come across as rude, or it's like I'm not intending to. But when you're trying to get
mm,
through a stack of hundreds of messages, sometimes you are a bit
mm,
shorter, right? Whereas what I say to people is when you've got somebody in front of you, that's a big way you can tell. So with Netflix, with Ev Williams and Mark Randolph, if I tried to email them again today, they probably wouldn't reply to me. It's not because they're bad people;
yeah,
it's just because they have a ton of stuff going on. But once you have their
absolutely.
attention, once you're in front of them, that's where you can tell a bit
Mm,
better, like what are they actually like. And you'll see it at networking events,
for
right? You
sure.
see the people who, oh, okay, this person's not useful to me, and they turn around and walk across the room, right? And that
Hmm.
says something about them. Whereas I see it as just chat to everybody. And you don't need to have a transactional mission from that. It's, you
Mhm.
never know. Like some of the most incredible things I've done, or the most incredible people I've met, it's just totally random. Well, I had no idea what they did, or I didn't know that that person knew that person who knew that person. I was just being nice to them because why shouldn't you be nice to somebody, right? To me, that's the default. You
Mhm.
should always just treat people with respect.
Sure.
And sometimes that leads to amazing things. Sometimes, and with this podcast, one of the big advice I'd have for you is it doesn't matter if something doesn't get a ton of views. It doesn't matter if something doesn't lead to something else. If you've enjoyed this
Mm.
conversation, hopefully you have, then that's the value in itself, right? You just live in that present. Like if this present moment, I'm learning, I'm enjoying the chat,
Yeah.
that's the win, right? You don't need anything else. And same
Mhm.
thing, any
Mhm.
conversation, anybody you meet. And if you look at life in that way, that I don't need to get your business card after this, I don't need to get you on LinkedIn. I'm just going to enjoy talking to you. You often
Yeah.
create much deeper relationships than, oh, I need to get
Yeah.
your LinkedIn. Oh, I need to do this. Or I need to do
Absolutely.
that.
Mhm. Absolutely agree. And no, I really like what you say there because I think even myself, when I think about this podcast, of course, you want to. The aim is to create a community of people and see where we can take this. But at the same time, I can't. I don't like to think way too far ahead and forget the process. And I really just like to ground myself and remember why I wanted to do this, and that was to have interesting conversations with people, genuinely like enjoying what I do and not thinking too much about you know the business side of things. I think that comes naturally if you enjoy what you do, if you truly enjoy. If you start thinking about that way too early, you kick yourself in the back, and it kind of doesn't happen. And I think that's one problem. That's one reason why a lot of people don't start the thing they want to. They already, we hear it constantly, but thinking way too early about the end goal and forgetting about the process and enjoying that process. Um, it's certainly something that I've had. That's probably, like I said, it's probably the reason why I didn't start the podcast earlier, because I was thinking about, being the next Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO, and not thinking about actually, okay, why do I want to do this? It's to have interesting conversations. So it's important for people to really, really remember that. So I'm glad you've reiterated it on here, because it's a really, really important message. But I mean, that actually leads me on. I mean, I know you mentioned at the start really quickly around the Bay HQ, but I'd love to sort of dive into that a bit deeper, because the Bay HQ, from what I understand, is you've created this podcast to really build this community of specifically for British Asian entrepreneurs, to inspire, connect, guide them, and create this community of positive growth mindset individuals who want to grow. Where did that idea stem from? What motivated you to start this? Aside from the experience you've had through Medium and the expanding the networks, why British Asians, for example? What was the idea behind that?
So it's interesting because when I had the original brand, I intentionally didn't play into me being Asian because, and I
Mm,
think for a lot of people, right, it's, to me, is I don't want to be a good writer for a brown person, right, or for an Asian person. I'm just a good writer, full stop. And
mm,
I think a lot of people make the mistake of playing too much into a small niche. It's like your ideas have value to everybody, not just people in their niche. So the Bay HQ are highlighting British Asians, but those same lessons can apply to anybody. Our listenership could be from any background and still learn. And I think that's one of the hacks I see, for example. I think happens a lot of women's events as well, right? A lot of women's events or women panels, most of the audience are also women, but men can learn from women. We can go to those events and learn and see different role models. And I think that's really important too, is having this space where we can learn from people from different backgrounds, whether it's people you share a background with or other people. But again, we come back to serendipity, right? Of there's somebody I used to dance with 10 years ago. I'm kind of retired from Bungalow. So I did a dance last week, but off the back of that, there's somebody I knew, like we're friends with, or on Instagram, with like that. And I saw she was organizing talks for EY Sikh Society. And then I was like, oh, I'd love to do that. That would be really interesting for me. And I can share my story of my transition from the corporate world to doing writing and blogging, which is probably quite interesting for a lot of people in that environment. Did that talk, and I mentioned how with Entrepreneur's Handbook, it's those massively scaled entrepreneurs, like, and made a bit of a joke about it. Like, if anybody happens to know anybody who's raised 40 million plus or like 50 million, let me know and I get them on the podcast. And then she said, oh, at the time, her fiance works for a venture capital firm. And off the back of that, me and him went for a coffee. We had a chat, and then it turned into a bit of a rant of why don't we have more of this kind of stuff? Why are we not meeting each other? How did this? Why did it have to be such a random reason for us to meet each other? And a big part of it is we're frustrated that a lot of Asians don't necessarily help each other, especially in the UK. And my experience, obviously, working with a lot of Americans, they will help each other out. They just seem more of that idea of just give back, where if I help you, then you help somebody else, and everybody grows together, right? The whole concept of the rising tide lift all ships, right? Is that
Mm,
me winning doesn't mean you lose. Whereas I
mm,
think sometimes we have that zero sum game in
yeah.
British Asian culture. And there's like different reasons for that because of our history and things like that of why that's the case. And then we're like, oh, why don't we do something about it? Because obviously the question at the beginning is like, oh, someone should do something about it. And then it's who's
Mm,
someone. And if you look at my background in terms of the media and the online presence, his background in terms of venture capital and investing, it made quite good sense, right?
yeah.
And this was just an idea because you say this kind of stuff. Same thing with the podcast, right? Oh yeah, we'll do that someday. Cool, sounds like a great idea. Let's do it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
And we're thinking about it. Ideas for like a launch in August, and this is where the story takes a bit of a turn. Where my dad got sick and passed away sadly in August, and it basically just turned everything upside down, right? Because what was the point of anything I was doing? Like, my dad passed away 2 months after he sold his company. He was about to enjoy a retirement, and then he was taken, right? And it's just, what's the point of all this stuff I'm doing if my dad, who went through so much in his life, worked so hard to get to where he was, and then that happens, right? And intentionally, I knew, like, it's still like, even now as I'm saying this, I can feel my eyes are getting watery, right? That's just, I know there's still that emotion. And the thing is, obviously, I found it, I can see, like, I'm not even looking at the camera now, right? So I could look up again. But
Mm, mm,
what happened basically is I knew that I needed to make sure that I didn't slip into a dark hole, right? Because that's what was going to happen. Where once you start questioning, what's the point? That's a
mm,
dark question to sometimes go down. And some people deal with that kind of trauma in lots of unhealthy ways, right? People can use their imagination of what goes on with a lot of people and how it can spiral really badly, really quickly. And I'm also going to say the intentional decision of I'm going to quit a lot of the other stuff I'm doing and focus purely on this. And it's a
mm,
not for profit. So the idea is like, can I actually make a difference? And
mm,
all of the fortune I've had in my life of having a dad who supported me, and it's not just about finances, it's about when I was going to quit my job to become a full time writer. He was like, yeah, go and do it. I believe in you, right? Just that simple thing of me changing from the corporate career into a creative career
mm,
with a lot less stability. And he could see, it's like, you're going to be happier doing that, so just do it. Whereas I was like, but what about security? What about stability? What about my career prospects? I was doing all the stuff you'd expect him to do. Whereas he was like, no,
mm,
you're going to be fine. I trust you. Like, you've got the ability. You're going to be amazing, right? And a lot of people don't have that. And that's like that's the thing I'm most lucky about, right? So my family believed in me when
mm,
I had the safe, stable job. I had the corporate career. I could have been like doing whatever. But I see it as that's not me, anything I've done, right? It's not me being whatever. It's me being very fortunate. And a lot of people don't have that fortune. Can I pay that back? Can I pay that forward? And one of the things that happened, because so originally the Bay HQ was going to be a side project, right? It's going to be maybe 20% of my time, a little thing that I'm going to do to try and help out, but it's only going to be one of my portfolio. Whereas now it's probably
sure.
90% of my time, and it's all not for profit. It's me pumping money into it, right? And
Yeah.
what basically happened then is, yeah, it's just this is something which to me is very visceral. It's very primal. Like I need to do this. There isn't. It's not like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this for fun. Like, oh yeah, let's see what happens, right? Whereas a lot of my motivation before was curiosity. Whereas now this is a lot more about like deeper meaning and purpose. And I saw this a lot because purpose and curiosity, not one is good or bad, right? And I think a lot of people think they have to have purpose, where if you don't have something particularly you care about a lot right now, that's fine. Do
Mm,
curiosity. Keep experimenting until you find the thing that you really love, that you really want to do. And
mm,
both of those options are good. It's better to follow your curiosity or your purpose than to follow your insecurity, which is what most people do. So I'd say, just I think sometimes people hear that story, be like, "Oh, but I don't have something like that in my life." That's fine. Like, be glad you don't have something like that in your life. Be grateful you don't have something that's turned your world upside down so much that you have this drive in that way. Because I'm jealous of you, right? Like, I'd much rather be following my curiosity still
mm,
than to have dealt with the pain that I've dealt with in the last year.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, absolutely hear you. And I think one thing I will say is, listen, you mentioned you were fortunate, perhaps, but there's one thing being fortunate, but also acting on those doors that are open to you is another thing. And you've taken that step and not taken for granted what perhaps your family have given you from a motivational standpoint, from a security standpoint. There's one people you can either just stand by and go with the flow, though you from what I hear, what I've seen, what you're doing now, the impact you're making, trust me, it's making, I mean, you probably get told this a ton, but listen, I just found you 6 months ago, right? I can't even remember how. I just found it on YouTube and immediately connected. I was literally on holiday. um you know it was really late at night, and I just came across it, and I think I listened to 3 episodes right there and then. So trust me when I say that the job you're doing is absolutely incredible, and I'm really loving this journey that you're going on. And even having met you now, it's so cool, like, to actually to hear it from you yourself. So I just want to say that to you, Amma, because, like, I think your life probably goes 100 miles an hour at the moment. You're focusing so deeply. I really hope that you do sometimes take time to reflect, sit down and see what you're doing, what you're achieving, because it really is inspiring. Okay, you're a big reason why I started my podcast. We're at the start of the journey here on the Nurture Network. But yeah, I'm learning a lot. I'm taking notes, even the small things. It really has been so helpful. So I just want to say thank you for that.
But I guess what I say is, like, as far as I'm concerned, I'm still on the start of my journey as well. And
Mm,
it comes back to, we go kind of full circle to Soshin, the beginner's mind, right? Is that I might be how many episodes in, I might have been whatever I've done, but to me, this is a 30-year, 40-year, 50-year project of my goalpost isn't how many followers I have or how many people listen. It's about, if somebody listening to the episode then goes and creates a business, or then meets people for our events, or does other things and gets involved, or meets somebody because of us, that then transforms their life, when they
mm,
create a business that transforms many people's lives, that to me is the goal. And in a way, I'm never almost going to know that, right? I'm not going to know every time. Not everybody's going to say, "Oh, your podcast helped me when I started my business," and that's fine. Like, it doesn't need to be my personal praise. And it's one of the things I think about a lot, is that I do suck at, like, taking the smelling the roses sometimes and stopping, but it's because I just see there's so much more to do and that can be done. So it's appreciating the progress, but also using it as fuel for the fire and to keep going. And that's where I see it. It's not sitting down and getting complacent. Okay, I've done this. I've done this. It's like, can I keep going? Can I keep that consistency of being there and being that? Like, it's, in a way, it's,
yeah,
there's a lot more to go still, right? And there's a lot more that can
I
be
hear you.
done, and there's a lot of
I
people that
hear you.
still need help. So that's
Hmm.
the, I very much suck at, like, oh yeah, it's great what I've done so far. It's like, this is just beginning to me.
I feel you. No, but that's keep that fire in your belly. You're gonna need it, because honestly, yeah, no, I absolutely hear you, and that I do. I think that's one trait that it's a trait that we see in all successful people, yes, appreciating the journey, but going that extra mile to keep going. Almost it's that kind of catch-22 of never being satisfied, but that's why they keep going, right? That's what it is. That's what you have to do. But as long as you're enjoying the process along the way, right?
I say that's the big thing is it's not it's being driven by wanting to do more rather than feeling I haven't done
Mm,
enough. And I think that's
mm,
kind of quite an important distinction because it's
okay.
not that it's the whole thing I said, like, if this fails tomorrow, then it's great that I was
Mm,
able to help some people, right? That's still better than not doing anything.
I like
And
that.
it's great that I've been able to have good conversations. And I don't want it to stop now, but should it, I can sit back and think, okay, I was able to talk to incredible people. I've
Mm,
met all these amazing stories, met amazing stories, met incredible people, heard these incredible stories.
mm,
Those stories have now been heard by more people and hopefully it helps them.
yeah,
And that's the thing, it's this isn't a failure if it doesn't reach my huge standards of that I hold myself to.
sure.
It's only a failure if I allow it to corrupt me, right? If I allow it to be about me rather than about who I'm helping. And I think
Yes,
that's the problem which I think a lot of people deal with. And that's one I'm very conscious of is this should never be about me. It should be about this is the reason why I'm doing it. Is
mm,
me getting more followers? Is me going to these events stuff? Is that helping that? Or is it just about, oh, look at me, I'm famous? It's like, because I'm not. And it was, I say that, I obviously saw you last week and it's like, oh, somebody recognizes me. Oh, that's cool. Right. And it is
yeah,
nice to have that.
yeah,
But that shouldn't be the reason I'm doing it is so people recognize me or people do this. Right.
of course.
And it's always keeping the ego in check, I think, is really important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love it. And but before we close off, right? Before we close off, Emma, I just want to ask, um, if you were to sort of, well, if you were going to recommend someone, I ask this to every guest, by the way. You know, someone wants to start something, they want to, whether it's starting a blog, they want to start a podcast, they want to do anything, and they want to start an Instagram page, they want to start a business, right? What mentality, do they need to get over that fear of judgment, that lack of self-belief, to just take that first step? What would you tell someone who wants to do that?
I'd say the biggest thing is not trying to make it too big, which, like I said, if you try to make a podcast from Stephen Bartlett, you're going to fail and you're also going to overplan. And I tell a lot of people this, right? Because my podcast is, or the Bay HQ is in person, in a studio. That's a high cost. There's a lot of risk involved in that. Episode released today, the cameras are out of focus. So I had to try and sharpen it afterwards, which is just, that's £100 and all that kind of stuff down the drain if that doesn't get fixed right. Is start small and also work out what's holding you back. What's a bit you're scared of? So, for example, if it's that people are going to judge you, start under a pseudonym, start under somebody else's name. Just get used to publishing whatever it is you're going to do, right? Don't start it under your name if you're worried about your reputation. It's it's one of my podcast guests called it this. I want to say it's Tiago. He called it a minimum viable fear, right? What's the smallest fear that you can overcome? Overcome that fear. Then what's the next minimum viable fear? Then overcome that one. Don't try, like everyone tries to go from 0 to 100. And that's a recipe for procrastination, to beating yourself up. And that I'd say is the biggest piece of advice is just work out the smallest bit you can do. And say, for example, writing, before I started writing articles, I was commenting on people's articles
Sure.
on Medium. So you can comment on people's articles, you can engage there. And then some people are liking my thoughts. Like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool that people like my thoughts. It gives you that validation before you start writing a full blog.
Mm,
And if you want to start writing, start on Twitter, start on LinkedIn before you do a full blog. I didn't do that, but it would have probably been a good idea for me to do that. If you want to start podcasting, maybe get on other people's podcasts before you do your own. Record some with your mates, like interview a friend who you know really well. Whereas everybody tries to like, oh, let me start with a celebrity guest. Like that's a really bad idea because then you're terrified. And then if it goes badly, you're then like, okay, you've just validated all your imposter syndrome, all your fear. Where start with friendly people, start with people that you know, start with people that make you feel comfortable. Don't even release the first few episodes if you don't want to, right? Get it to the stage, okay, let me just record a podcast. And this advice is different for different people as well, because I given the opposite advice to somebody earlier today who's She's got big following. She does in-person events, which is like live in-person panel events and things. And she's going to release a podcast. And for her, the advice is just set a date and get it out, because you've got the experience. You know what you're doing. You just need to get it out. But it's knowing yourself really well. What's stopping you? And write that down. For some people, that's the best way to do this. What is stopping me from doing this? And also get somebody who knows you well to call you out on it, because sometimes we lie to ourselves, right? And get someone to question, okay, you said you're not doing it because of that, but then does it actually matter, or you just using that as an excuse?
Mm.
So to summarize
Yeah.
that, yeah, work out the smallest possible thing you can overcome and overcome that, rather than try to become a hero straight away.
Yeah. Love it. Love that advice. That's an awesome way to finish off the podcast. But yeah, I really do. I'm gonna write that one down. It's different. I haven't heard that advice before, actually. So that's one for me to note. But honestly, thank you so much, Emma, for coming on. There's certainly a lot of value in there for the listeners. And if for you guys listening, please, as always, if you're listening on Spotify, follow Apple Podcasts, follow, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It really does help and go a long way. And definitely check out Emma's podcast, the Bay HQ. There's some really amazing content there that's going to help, I'm sure, every single one of you. But thank you so much, Emma, and thank you everyone to who was listening. I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.
Thanks for having me.